Well, welcome everyone to tonight's session. I am Dr. Alexis Osorio Gisola, the Managing Director of Multilingual Education for KIPP, Texas. And I am so excited to be meeting today. We're here to help provide some information about COVID-19 vaccine that will likely be approved for our children ages 5 through 11. The FDA has already approved it, and we're likely days away from the CDC's approval, which will be the final steps before it comes available nationwide. KIPP, Texas serves more than 32,000 students, which many of whom are between these ages. So we want to be able to inform our families and the general public about the facts and the myths related to this vaccine. We're here today to answer your questions. We have our English session starting now at 5:30, followed by our Spanish session that begins at 6:15. If you have any questions during this session, please enter them into the chat and we'll be answering them as soon as possible. To really address today's important topic, we're excited to introduce Dr. Maria Rivera. Dr. Rivera is our Managing Director of Student Wellness for KIPP, Texas. She is a public health physician and a board certified pediatrician. Prior to joining KIPP, Texas, she was one of the health authorities at the Harris County Public Health and worked closely at helping schools navigate COVID-19 pandemic. We're excited that she's now part of our KIPP family and that we have her here again tonight. So welcome, Dr. Rivera.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here today.
Well, Dr. Rivera, thank you again for joining us. And we've been able to collect some questions from our families and really trying to answer, is this what do we know and what can we move forward? So our first question of the night, what is the current COVID-19 situation in Texas right now? And really, what do we know? Are cases going up? Are they going down? And what about our different our different KIPP regions that we support?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So what we know is that overall cases in Texas are decreasing, which is great. The issue is that we are still seeing more than 4,000 cases per day in our state, and in each of our regions in Dallas, San Antonio, Austin, and Houston, we are still seeing a fair number of people that are hospitalized for COVID-19, both in our general beds in the hospital, but also in our intensive care units. And so what that means is that we're still in a position where we are still worried about this virus. We are still not out of it entirely, and it still may be a couple of weeks before we're completely out of this COVID-19 Delta surge, and we're not quite sure what's going to happen as the months start becoming cooler, everyone starts going inside, if there's another surge coming or not. And so I think we're cautiously optimistic in that cases are decreasing, but we're still a little bit of a ways away to really be out of this pandemic.
Thank you, Dr. Rivera. It's good news that we're hearing that this is decreasing, but as you mentioned, we're going into this winter season. With that in mind, I know our families were wondering, okay, what percentage of Texans are actually fully vaccinated?
Yeah, so right now we're estimating around 50%, 51-ish% of Texans are fully vaccinated, and this includes the 0 to 12-year-old age group. When we look at just the 12 and up, which are the ones that are currently authorized, that number goes up a little bit to around 64%. Have received both doses of the COVID-19 vaccine if they receive the Pfizer or the Moderna vaccine, or the one dose of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And we do know that somewhere around 74% of Texans over the age of 12 have received at least one dose of the vaccine. A lot of those are still pending in their series. They're going to receive another dose of Pfizer or Moderna, and some, for whatever reason, just have decided that they're not going to receive another dose or haven't been able to receive another dose. And so we're still quite a ways away from kind of this target, at least 80–90% vaccination for our whole population that we are hoping to see with a virus like SARS-CoV-2, especially the Delta variant, that can be really, really contagious.
Okay, so we still have some work to do as a state. I see that. A question that has come up, especially related to getting our vaccine, is that people mention that they've heard people passing away or dying from the COVID-19 vaccine. Can you share some more on that information?
Yeah, so in the US, we have a really, really good surveillance system for all the safety measures that are related to the COVID-19 vaccine. And so there are scientists that are directly asking questions and looking into the information. And then we also have a system called the Rivera, where anyone can report any form of adverse event that could potentially have been reported with the vaccine. And so when we take all the deaths that have been entered in VAERS by people, and these don't have to be physicians, this can be anyone, just enters it into the system. It could be related to the vaccine. It most likely isn't. But if we take all of those entries, we still only have a 0.0002% death rate with the COVID-19 vaccine. And that's if we assume that everyone who's put in any form of death in the month after the COVID-19 vaccine is related. When you really take a look at it, then the vast majority, 99.9% of these deaths are found not to be related to the COVID-19 vaccine. And so this is an extremely effective, extremely safe vaccine. And the only, in the US, the only place where we have found that there have been some deaths that have been tied to the COVID-19 vaccine is when people develop something called TTS, which is when they can have some clots in their brain, or also potentially some bleeding, and those have led to around 5 deaths in the US that were potentially linked to the COVID-19 vaccine. But when you think about the millions and millions of people that we vaccinated, that's less than 0.00001%. So it's an extremely small number.
Well, Dr. Rivera, thank you for that reassurance. I know sometimes that's the hesitancy of not knowing whether or not we're making the right choice. And like myself, I am vaccinated. I'm just wondering about like our teachers and school staff. Can they get a booster already, or when is it recommended to get a booster shot?
Yeah, and so the FDA and the CDC have both put out recommendations on booster shots. And what's recommended right now is for teachers and school staff, so anyone who's working in the education setting is eligible for a booster already right now if it's been at least 6 months since their second dose. That's because they're considered to be part of the group that's working in a high-risk setting for contracting COVID-19. And so right now, it's only recommended for certain groups. So if you work in a high-risk setting, such as our teachers, but also if you have any high-risk conditions that put you at risk for serious COVID-19, some of these are obesity, hypertension, and other heart conditions, being immunosuppressed, such as having cancer, having transplant, and a couple other conditions. So any of our teachers or staff that fall into that group also qualify, in addition to just by working, or any of their family members qualify as well. For anyone who's over the age of 65 qualifies for a booster right now. But since education is considered a high-risk setting for contracting COVID-19, anyone who works at KIPP right now as KIPP staff is eligible for a booster as long as it's been 6 months since their previous dose.
Thank you so much with that information. I know I need to make my appointment. And then these next questions, really, our families are wondering about our adolescent students, like, and how we should be responding and thinking, especially with this new shot. So as we're thinking about currently, how many adolescents have been vaccinated with the COVID-19 vaccine?
Yeah, so the COVID-19 vaccine rollout has been one of the biggest public health successes in our time. It's been one of the most effective vaccination rollouts, even though we're still seeing some people that haven't gotten vaccinated. The most number of vaccines we have essentially ever distributed in such a short period of time across the world. And so when we take a look just at the 12 to 18-year-olds, we vaccinated more than 15 million 12 to 18-year-olds around the world. And so that gives us a lot of reassurance by looking at the safety data. It means we have a lot of data to work with as we start thinking about the little ones that we'll talk about today too.
Thank you. So when we think about our students, right now, what are some of those risks associated with the Pfizer vaccine for our adolescent students?
Yeah, and so the Pfizer vaccine is interesting that it's the only vaccine that's right now authorized for 12 and up, and it's the vaccine that the FDA has just approved for the 5 to 11-year-olds, and that we're waiting for the CDC to approve in the coming days as well. And so there's the one main risk that has been associated with the Pfizer vaccine is a risk of potential myocarditis or pericarditis. And so myocarditis is the inflammation of the heart muscle, and pericarditis is inflammation of the lining around the heart. And these, when you really think about it and when you really look at the numbers, this has been extremely rare. It's somewhere around 27 cases per 1 million doses. And in the US, the majority of these cases, for whatever reasons, have been in young men. It seems to be more common in men than in women, particularly young men and adolescent men. And all the cases seem to be self-limiting. They last maximum around 6 months. There have not been any deaths related to myocarditis or pericarditis in the US. And what we know that's also really important for people to know is that the risk of getting myocarditis or pericarditis from the COVID-19 virus is much, much higher than the risk of getting it from the COVID-19 vaccine. And so it is a risk, a very, very small risk from the COVID-19 vaccine, but it's a much bigger risk from the COVID-19 virus. And when you look at the severity or how serious the illness is when you get it as related to the virus, it's much, much more serious. There have been deaths associated with myocarditis or pericarditis from COVID-19 in the US. And we're even seeing, even in some cases where adolescents or kids have mild symptoms of COVID-19 when they get the virus, if you look later on, you actually can see that they have damage to their heart and do show symptoms where they could have had myocarditis or pericarditis later on. And so I think, when the FDA and other scientists kind of look at the models comparing the risks, particularly of myocarditis, pericarditis, to the benefits outweigh the risk in all the different models, even as cases go up and down in our community.
Well, thank you. That is such valuable information, especially if we think about risking whether we're getting a vaccine or not. And I know you talked about males, but now when we think about like our young girls, so how does the COVID-19 vaccine can it affect fertility in women? Can we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so this is a really, really common question, and we're seeing it circle a lot in social media and in other places. And I know that this is a worry of parents of young women, especially parents of little girls that haven't gone through puberty. And so what we know now is that there isn't a link between the COVID-19 vaccine and fertility, and we don't think that there is any link. So if you think biologically of any possible mechanism where there could be some form of interaction, we can't find any form of interaction. But what we also know now that we have so many hundreds of millions of doses that have been administered, including in women of childbearing age who have gone on to get successfully pregnant and delivered babies, and also in women that are currently pregnant, is that there doesn't seem to be any form of interaction between the vaccine and getting pregnant or affecting the fetus or the baby. And what we do know, though, is that the COVID-19 vaccine, but not just the COVID-19 vaccine, pretty much any vaccine can mess up your menstrual cycle a little bit. And so some people are reporting that their period comes a little bit early, their period comes late, their period is heavier or shorter, etc. And we know that this is true. And we know that this is actually really common just in general with vaccines. It can be really common with just getting a virus too. It can be common with stress. Sometimes your menstrual cycle changes if you've been exercising too much. And that doesn't mean that there's going to be any long-term effects of fertility, but we think that that's one of the reasons why people started getting nervous. And then people also started looking at, well, the antibodies or the cells that your body makes to fight the COVID-19 virus, those antibodies will think that the baby's placenta is COVID-19, but when you really look at placentas of people that have received the COVID-19 vaccine, or even that have had COVID-19, because we kind of produce very similar antibodies, the placenta doesn't show any signs of any issues unless the mom was severely sick with COVID-19. And so if the moms did well, or if the moms just got vaccinated, there's no issues with the placenta. And even though we're specifically talking about women, one thing that we do know is that the COVID-19 virus can affect fertility in men. Not the vaccine, but the COVID-19 virus can actually cause issues with sperm count and it can also cause other issues from men, erectile dysfunction, etc. And so there aren't any links of how the COVID-19 vaccine can affect fertility in men or women, but there are links how the COVID-19 virus can affect fertility, particularly in men.
Okay. Wow. Okay. That's really good information to take back and really thinking about. Our next question is about long COVID. And for one, thank you. You're the first person that introduced that concept to me. And really the question for our audience is long COVID. What is it and how does it affect children?
Yeah, so long COVID is when someone has the COVID-19 virus and you check in with them weeks or months later and they're still having symptoms. So essentially 6 months later, people are still having symptoms. At first, we thought that, maybe since our kids we think they're having mild cases of COVID, maybe they won't have long COVID symptoms. But what we're learning now is that 1 out of 7 kids, if you look 6 months down the line, are still having symptoms of COVID-19. And so if you think about just like your typical classroom where you have somewhere between 28, 35 kids, and all the kids get COVID-19 in that classroom, 4 or 5 of those kids are going to have symptoms long term. And often these symptoms can be really debilitating to their day-to-day lives. So they can be really bad fatigue, where they're just feeling really tired, or they can have brain fog, where they feel like their minds aren't necessarily working, which can really affect them in school. But the most common symptom that can be kind of lingering in this long COVID in kids is pulmonary symptoms. So some kids can have like asthma-like symptoms or just a prolonged cough for a really long time. It's kind of just nagging and annoying, like when you have a virus and you're kind of just coughing forever. Those are some of the most common. And we've also seen some kids that are reporting mental health issues after having COVID-19 kind of 6 months down the line, as well as just things that you may not think that could affect your day-to-day as much, but the lack of sensor of taste or smell, that can linger in some people. And it can be really debilitating for people when you feel like you can't taste any of the food that you're eating, especially if you really enjoy eating. And so that's just another big reason why vaccinating our kids is so important, to try to prevent this long COVID, which can affect at least 1 in 7 of our kids.
Yeah, those are some really great points and something for us to keep in mind, especially as educators and as parents. And so just really the big question is, so why is it so important for us to vaccinate our kids or vaccinate adults, especially when sometimes the comments are that our students really don't get very sick?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so one of the things is, one of the arguments that I use is long COVID, that even though our kids and our adolescents may not get very sick, they can still have long COVID symptoms that can really affect them. The other is that when you really take a look at the number of kids and teenagers that end up in the hospital with COVID-19, at least 30% of them had no underlying conditions at all. And so one of the first things that people ask is, so-and-so ended up in the hospital. So what did they have? Like, did they have cancer? Did they have something else? At least 30% of these kids don't have any form of underlying condition. And so totally healthy kids and adolescents that get COVID-19 that are not vaccinated can end up in the hospital. And so kids can get very, very sick. And from any kid that ends up in the hospital, at least a third of them end up in the ICU with more severe COVID-19. And then the other reason is that we don't know exactly why it happens, but there's certain kids that develop something called MIS-C, or multi-inflammatory syndrome, in children, which is an inflammation of your blood vessels, can be an inflammation of your heart, and that usually happens a couple weeks after you've had the COVID-19 virus. And so some kids don't even know that they've had COVID-19. They had totally mild symptoms. They were totally fine. And then a couple of weeks later, they get incredibly sick. Usually these kids end up in the ICU. We've seen more than 5,000 cases through the US, and we think that number is actually an underestimate. We think that there's actually more of those cases, but we do know that our kids get really, really sick. And so separate from the fact that the more people that we vaccinate in general in our population, the better we will all do and the faster we will kind of get out of this pandemic, is the idea that we really, really need to protect our kids themselves, because kids can and do get really sick.
Yeah, that's a really great way to compare, our actions that we're taking, especially the next question, I think really relates to what you were going through or explaining is, so are vaccinated adolescents protected compared to unvaccinated adolescents? Sorry.
Yeah, and so when you take a look at the adolescents or teenagers that end up in the hospital, there was a study that looked at it, looked specifically at whether they're vaccinated or unvaccinated. The COVID-19 vaccine is not 100% protective, especially with people with underlying conditions, even though we know that people without any underlying conditions still get hospitalized. But when you take a look at the numbers, around 93% or 97%, of the teens that ended up in the hospital were unvaccinated. So only 3% were vaccinated. And then if you take a look at the ICU, none of the vaccinated teens ended up in the intensive care unit or died in this study. Only unvaccinated teens did. And so we know that the COVID-19 vaccine makes you 10 times less likely to be hospitalized and then 10 times less likely to die than if you're unvaccinated. And just from just getting the infection in general, you're 5 times more likely to get the infection if you're an unvaccinated teenager compared to a vaccinated teen.
Thank you, Dr. Rivera. That really helps thinking about our adolescent students and thinking about having that 10 times less chance. As we move on in our questions for tonight, these last questions are about our children. So as we open up this 5 to 11-year-old range, our first question is, what side effects did they see in children or in these kids in the trials for students that were in ages 5 through 11?
Yeah, so what they saw was very similar to some of the side effects that we see from the COVID-19 vaccines in teenagers and adolescents. And so most commonly, kind of these body aches, fatigue or exhaustion feeling afterwards. Some kids reported headaches. And what was interesting is that there were less kids reported fevers and chills compared to adults and teenagers. We don't know exactly why that is. The majority of the side effects happened after the second dose, which is very similar to what we see in adults. But they were all very mild and usually self-resolved within 24 hours.
Sounds very familiar. So with that going in mind, as we're all on social media, and one of the posts that really are whether or not we should be vaccinating our 5 through 11-year-olds is this question about how you can still infect someone or pass on the COVID-19 after you've received your vaccine. Can you tell us more about if that's true or what that means?
Yeah, so right now, one thing that we even know that there's a school district in Florida that's not allowing kids to go to school 30 days after they've been vaccinated, because there's this idea that right after you receive your COVID-19 vaccine, you're going to catch shed virus and infect everyone around you just from getting the COVID-19 vaccine. And this is absolutely not true. When you take a look at all the ingredients in the vaccine, it's not a live vaccine. It doesn't have any form of inactivated virus, so it doesn't have any parts of the virus at all. It just has genetic material, which is kind of like the recipe to give your body to produce the cells or the antibodies that will protect you against the virus. There are some vaccines that have live virus in them that potentially could have some of this shedding that can be dangerous for some people with immunocompromised states, etc. But the COVID-19 vaccine does not cause you to shed virus. You cannot infect anyone from the COVID-19 vaccine. You're getting it right after. If you do get COVID-19 or if you are exposed to the COVID-19 virus, it is still possible to transmit the virus even if you've been vaccinated. But we know that the rate of transmission or the chance that you're going to pass it on to someone else is way, way lower if you have been vaccinated. But that's a little bit different than if you just get the vaccine and you kind of start shedding virus, and that's completely a myth. That does not happen.
Thank you. our next question, and I know I've thought about it with my own students, at this age group, we're getting multiple shots every year at our well checkups. So the question is, if my kid needs multiple shots, how will that will the COVID-19 vaccine affect those shots that we're having to get?
Yeah. So when we first started administering the COVID-19 vaccine, there was a recommendation that you should wait 2 weeks between shots if you're going to be getting another shot. However, what we know now is that it doesn't make any difference. The COVID-19 vaccine does not interact with other vaccines. Your immune response is just as good. And so the recommendation now is that if you need to get multiple vaccines, if you need to get them the same day, you can still go ahead and do that. And so especially with our kids that are getting multiple childhood vaccines, there's no interaction. They can get the vaccine the same day. You don't have to do any form of waiting period in between. And so that really is coming into account right now with flu. And so I know that we're promoting the COVID-19 vaccine here today, but I also highly recommend the flu vaccine in our kids as we're entering flu season.
Right. Thank you. I know that was my husband specific question. All right. And then, if my child is completely healthy, why should I consider vaccinating them?
Yeah, and so I think that this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, where we know that kids can get really sick. At least 30% of kids that get really sick were completely healthy, did not have any other conditions. We also know that when we take a look at the studies about whether kids can pass on the virus to others, we know that does happen, that kids can contract the virus, perhaps have really mild symptoms, to pass it on to people at home, including our grandparents or including our older adults or people with other conditions where for whatever reason the vaccine hasn't been as effective, especially if they've had cancer, transplants, or something else. And so as part of kind of this community, it's really important for us to continue to vaccinate our kids, but also just to protect themselves so that they don't get long COVID, so that they don't have all these symptoms for more than 6 months, so that they don't have MIS-C or multi-inflammatory syndrome in children. And also just so that they don't get really sick. We've had almost 100 deaths of COVID-19 in kids in the U.S., which some people are like, well, that's not that big of a number, but 100 deaths is still 100 kids that have died, and a lot of those deaths were preventable. And so if we can prevent any more deaths of children, then I think that's something that we should do. I don't think that's something that we should be messing around with or risking.
Some really great points. So going into our next question and really thinking with that in mind, is the vaccine effective? I know so many people that have gotten the COVID vaccine and still gotten COVID. Right?
Yeah. And so we know that no vaccine is completely 100% effective. The COVID-19 vaccine is one of the most effective vaccines that we have, particularly the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines. And what we know is that once there's certain variants, like when the Delta variant came around, preventing the total illness dropped a little bit. But when we start looking at the numbers in the study where they were looking at just the kids, the 5 to 11-year-olds in the Pfizer trial, the effectiveness that they're reporting is around 91% to prevent any form of infection, which is still an extremely effective vaccine. And in this particular study, none of the kids that received the vaccine had any serious COVID symptoms. So none of them ended up in the hospital. None of them were severe. None of them went to the ICU. None of them died. We often see once we kind of deploy it to a huge population that some of these numbers tweak a little bit, but it's still an extremely effective vaccine. And what we know, even in adults that are getting COVID-19